and there's up quarks and down quarks, and top quarks and bottom quarks, I think, and 2 more kinds. There's 6 kinds of quarks, I don't know. And then what are the quarks made of? This has got to be the most popular argument for moral skepticism. The argument that we're talking about today is a kind of argument from disagreement. The idea is very intuitive. It occurs to lots of students who are trying to defend some claim against the existence of objective moral truths. Some version of this argument where you point towards all the disagreement that we observe in the world about moral matters and how persistent it is. And you conclude from that that moral skepticism is true, that there are no objective moral truths. That's what we're talking about today. That's what gets talked about in this chapter from Shafer-Landau. And the argument is rather simple. Here it is. It's something like the following. Okay, that's the argument. 1, moral claims are subject to persistent disagreement. 2, if some claims are subject to persistent disagreement, then they are not objectively true. 3, therefore, moral claims are not objectively true. And this one we recognize, this just is moral skepticism. So if this argument works, then moral objectivism, as we've been calling it, is false. There are no objective, universal moral facts that apply to everyone everywhere, no matter what their circumstances, no matter what culture they're in or anything like that. And, well, moral skepticism, as we've defined it, is just the opposite of that. It's just the claim that there are no objective, universal moral truths. Okay, so is this argument any good? Well, as it's stated, it is properly logically structured. The technical name for this in logic is that it is a logically valid argument. That is, if both premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. It's guaranteed to be true, right? And this argument is structured that way. So if we're going to find fault with this argument, and we're going to save the existence of some kind of objective moral truths, we're going to have to object either to premise 2 or premise 1. In the reading, Shafer-Landau starts by putting a little bit of pressure on premise 1. For one thing, the kind of disagreement that we find about moral matters is often exaggerated. Like issues like abortion or euthanasia, issues about which there's a huge amount of moral disagreement and the moral disagreement sticks around for a while. It doesn't just go away after talking it out with someone. Those examples are actually somewhat rare and they get all of the publicity. Really though, there's an enormous number of issues about which we widely agree. Murder is wrong. I mean, if you want some more evidence of this, think about how this course has been operating. If you're enrolled in this course, then you've been discussing these issues, the topics that we've been talking about, with your classmates on the online discussion boards. And think about how many times on those discussion boards someone has needed to give an example of some morally heinous action or some morally good action. And they were just able to produce some example, and everyone just went along with it. That's because everyone else in the discussion board agrees, yeah, that's a terrible thing. And this is true even if you taught this course to an extremely diverse group of people from all over the world. There would be a lot of things that everyone would agree about. So then it actually occurs to me, this isn't in the chapter, but it occurs to me that, well, it might not be the case that you have to take moral claims altogether, all moral claims in general, right? There are some specific moral claims, like that murder is wrong. Those moral claims, well, they're not subject to persistent disagreement. So if we're allowed to consider individual moral claims, not just the whole category of moral claims in general, if we're allowed to consider individual moral claims, then this argument is not going to work for lots of moral claims, and then there's going to end up being many moral claims where we don't reach the conclusion that they're not objectively true. And the moral objectivist, remember, only needs it to be the case that there are some objective moral truths. Okay, but even if we separated out the moral claims and we were able to save, say, the claim that murder is wrong from this argument, there would still be lots of moral claims that, if this were a good argument, would be shown to be not objectively true, like claims about whether abortion is morally permissible or impermissible. And most moral objectivists, they think that there's an objective fact even about those controversial moral topics or moral issues. They think that there's just a fact about whether abortion is morally permissible or morally heinous. And so if this argument works, then the moral objectivist might be able to weasel out of it in some technical sense, but it would still be a loss. They would lose objective truth for lots of the moral claims that they originally thought there was objective truth for. Shafer-Landau started by putting some pressure on this premise: moral claims are subject to persistent disagreement. But then he sort of, after putting a little bit of pressure on it, just sort of grants, well, you're right, there is actually quite a bit of disagreement. So maybe the real way to undermine this argument is to focus on premise 2, just the claim that if some claims are subject to persistent disagreement, then they're not objectively true. The problem with this is that it really matters how we understand persistent disagreement. I mean, it seems like under some understanding of the phrase, there's persistent disagreement in domains where we definitely think there's an objective truth. For example, and this is the example from the chapter, there's persistent disagreement, or some significant disagreement, about whether or not string theory is correct. String theory, I don't really even know what string theory is, but it's some theory in fundamental physics. Atoms are made of protons and neutrons and electrons, and those smaller particles in the nucleus, the protons and the neutrons, what are they made up of? Well, they're made up of quarks, and there's up quarks and down quarks, and top quarks and bottom quarks, I think, and 2 more kinds. There's 6 kinds of quarks, I don't know. And then what are the quarks made of? Well, I'm not sure. Maybe there's some other steps along the way. But according to some physicists, they're made of strings. And then when you watch when you watch those shows, they always show the strings as like a little loop. And the strings vibrate. And there's different patterns with which they vibrate. And if they vibrate in one way, then the particle that they compose is one type of particle. And if they vibrate another way, then the particle that they compose is another type of particle. Okay, that's it. We've reached the end of my understanding, if it's any understanding at all, of string theory. The point is, string theory is controversial. And scientists disagree with one another. And they continue to disagree with one another about whether it's true. And it's competing with some other theory. But anyway, there's this disagreement. But do we conclude from the fact that there's this persistent disagreement that there's no objective truth? No, we don't conclude that, and we shouldn't conclude that. Either the quarks are made up of strings that vibrate in certain ways, or they're not. They're made of something else. There's just an objective fact. And the fact that there's all this disagreement about it doesn't suggest that there isn't an objective fact. It just suggests that it's really hard to figure out what that objective fact is, and there's evidence that pulls some people in some directions and other people in another direction. So what we would need if we wanted to make premise 2 plausible is we would need an understanding of the notion of persistent disagreement, whereon the disagreement has to last long enough such that scientific disagreements don't qualify, but that moral disagreements do qualify. Here's what I have in mind. Scientific disagreements, they really kind of cap out at, 20 or 30 or 40 years. They don't seem to last much longer than that. I mean, science, sort of modern science isn't that old. It's like, I don't know how old it is. It's 500 years old? I don't know. When was Galileo alive? That was at the beginning? 17th century? Whenever science started, it wasn't that long ago, but put that aside. These scientific disagreements, the disagreement about string theory, there was incredible disagreement about plate tectonics in geology. This disagreement, it went on, they gathered more evidence. It seemed rather robust, the disagreement that is. And then, after 30 years, it goes away. The evidence becomes overwhelming and everybody settles on one conclusion. Whereas the moral disagreements, some moral disagreements, seem to last for hundreds of years or thousands of years. So there seems to be some real difference here. And we could probably capture that by redefining or re-understanding the notion of persistence of these disagreements. So we could just define, here's what we could do. If we want to make premise 2 plausible, we could just define a new phrase, and that phrase is very persistent. Very persistent. A disagreement is very persistent if it lasts several generations, right? Not just 20 or 30 years, but 90 or 100 or 200 years, something like that. Then premise 2 is looking a lot better, right? But notice this. If we modify premise 2 to make it clearer and thereby make it more plausible, we also have to modify premise 1 so that the argument stays valid, so that its structure stays truth-preserving. Okay, fine. So we just add the word very here as well. And we have a precise, or a rather precise, definition of very persistent in mind. Moral claims are subject to very persistent disagreement, lasting more than a few generations. If some claims are subject to very persistent disagreement, then they are not objectively true. Therefore, moral claims are not objectively true. Continue to focus on premise 2 for a bit. If premise 2 is plausible, why is it plausible? Like, what kind of thought pattern does it exhibit? I suggest that it exhibits a rather famous kind of pattern, a rather famous pattern of thought. It's an example of what philosophers and scientists sometimes call inference to the best explanation. If you haven't heard of inference to the best explanation before, let me just point out, it is something that is absolutely essential to your life. I mean, what are the things that are important to your life? I don't know, water, oxygen, your family, I don't know, Fortnite, that's a video game, I hear, or something like that. Whatever it is, inference to the best explanation, that's got to be in the top 10. You might have heard this phrase before or not, and you might sort of be able to figure out what it means because it's a rather transparent label. But this, whatever this is, I'm telling you, this is one of the most important things in your life. You use it every day. Okay, what is it? It's the following pattern of thought. It's when you observe something, some fact or some apparent fact, and you need an explanation for it. And you don't really know what the explanation is, but you have a few possibilities that you can call to mind. You think about these possibilities, you think about how plausible they are as explanations, and then you take the best one and you just believe that it's true. That's inference to the best explanation. Here's an example. First, you've got something that needs to be explained, right? Something that needs explanation. So here's a sort of famous example. You walk out of your home or your apartment or whatever, and you see some grass by the sidewalk or on the lawn or wherever, and the grass is wet. That's the thing that needs to be explained. And then there are all of the various possible explanations. And there's multiple possible explanations. Here's one. One possible explanation is that it rained, right? You were unconscious the night before, you were sleeping, but maybe while you were sleeping it rained, and then that's why the grass is wet. The water stayed on the grass. It hasn't evaporated, and it hasn't been absorbed into the soil or whatever. So one possibility is that it rained. Another possible explanation of the same fact, the wetness of the grass, is that someone or something watered the grass. Either, with one of those temporary sprinklers that you plug a hose to and you put down, like the one that's got like an arch and it's got the holes in it and it goes over, and that's the best one to jump over. Or a built-in, I say thing here because it could be a built-in sprinkler system that just goes on automatically. No one actually waters the grass, but the mechanism, the machine waters the grass, right? Something like that. Or that's another alternative explanation. Or here's another explanation. Maybe your neighbor, right? Maybe your neighbor spat on the grass a lot. It took all night just out there spitting over and over again. That would get the grass wet. That's another possible explanation. Okay, which one's the best? Well, it depends on the circumstances, right? I mean, if you live in a place where it frequently rains, and if there's no sprinkler system built into the ground and there's no one who's being paid to water this grass, maybe it's your grass and you know that you haven't paid anyone to water it, so probably no one is being paid to water it, and you know you didn't water it, right? Then this is not such a good explanation, and this is a pretty good one, so maybe then this is the best explanation. Or if you live in some place that doesn't get a lot of rain, and you know that there's a sprinkler system set up, and the sprinkler system goes on at night, not every night, but some nights, you don't know which nights, well then this might be a better explanation because rain is pretty rare. And there's probably some circumstances, and they're pretty hard to imagine, you'd have to stretch your imagination, but on which your neighbor spitting on the grass is the best explanation. Okay, so you don't really know what happened, but you factor all this in, and let's say that you live in a place where it rains, and you conclude that this is the best explanation. So then you believe it. Then you go on believing that it rained the night before, because you saw that the grass was wet, and the best explanation for that was that it rained. You do this all the time, every day, hundreds of times a day. You see a bag of potato chips on the ground at a store, right next to the rack with all the potato chips. How did it get there? What explains the fact that this bag is on the floor? Well, maybe it fell. Looks kind of like it naturally could have fallen and would have landed there. And you know about bags falling and how likely that is, right? Or another explanation is that there's some avant-garde installation art piece and that the bag was placed there carefully to represent capitalism or something like that. That's another possibility. And you consider these possibilities and you pick the best one, and that's what you believe. And you do this without consciously thinking through lots of the possibilities, right? Some of them are live, some of them don't even make it into the mix, right? You use this all the time. The thought is, that's what's going on here. Premise 2, if it's plausible at all, is plausible because it's an example of inference to the best explanation, right? There's something that needs to be explained, and the best explanation for it, well, in this case, is that there are no objective moral truths. Okay, so let's plug that in over here. Okay, check your understanding now. We're going to take premise 2 and put it in this format. We're going to specify the thing that needs explanation, and then we're going to specify, well, at least according to premise 2, what supposedly the best explanation for that is. So what am I about to write here? I'm going to write the thing that needs explanation in this case. What is that? You should know, or you should pause the video and figure it out. What is the thing that needs explanation? Got it? The thing that needs explanation is very persistent disagreement. And this very persistent disagreement that we're talking about in premise 2, it's not moral disagreement, it's not any specific type of disagreement, because premise 2 is just a general claim about, well, some claims, whatever claims they are. So very persistent disagreement in some domain. That's the thing that needs to be explained. And according to premise 2, one explanation is the best one, and it's the one that we should conclude is correct if there is this thing, if there is very persistent disagreement. What is that? What is the best explanation according to premise 2? the best explanation is that there is no objective truth about that matter. Those claims are not objectively true, the ones about which there is persistent or very persistent disagreement. That's the best explanation according to premise 2. But here's the thing. Inference to the best explanation works by considering a bunch of explanations. It doesn't have to be a long list. Maybe it only has to be 2 items long, right? But it can't just be that you consider one explanation and that it's the best of the group because, well, if the group includes only one thing, then that thing is the best of the group, it's the worst of the group, right? So there needs to be at least one more. And the one that's suggested in this chapter by Shafer-Landau is some kind or other of human error. That makes sense, right? I mean, you could see how human error could explain very persistent disagreement. Some kind of mistake, some kind of mental error that people are making causes them to keep disagreeing with one another. And that could be the case even if there were an objective truth of the matter, right? So this is, at minimum, an alternative explanation. And the claim of premise 2 seems to include the idea that, well, human error is not the best explanation. Objective truth, then, is the best explanation. If that's right, then, well, we could sort of rewrite premise 2 again, make it even clearer, and sort of include this fact, the fact that it's an example of inference to the best explanation, in the premise as we state it. We would rewrite it in sort of the following way. Okay, that's the revised premise. If some claims are subject to very persistent disagreement, lasting more than several generations, and that persistent disagreement is not best explained by human error, then those claims are not objectively true. This new version of premise 2 is looking better. It's looking pretty good. Here's an example to bring out how plausible this is. So take, for example, matters of taste. I've used this example before in this course. Claims about what's tasty. It seems like there's disagreement, and it sticks around, right? I mean, people have been disagreeing for a long time whether coffee tastes good, or whether alcohol tastes good, or whether pickles taste good, or whatever. And it doesn't seem like the best explanation for this, or even a half-decent explanation for this, is that some of the folks are making some kind of error, or making some kind of mistake. They're making a mistake when they think that pickles aren't tasty. They don't like pickles. Well, then it seems like the next best explanation is that there are no universal or objective truths about what is tasty. There are truths about what is tasty. It's just that they're subjective. They're different for each person. For some people, pickles are tasty. For other people, they're not. And that just does seem like the best available explanation, well, when we can explain the disagreement in terms of human error. So 2 is looking better. We now understand what's going on behind the scenes. We've sort of made it more explicit. We've specified that the disagreement has to last for a long time, and so we can't use scientific disagreement as a kind of counterexample to premise 2. But notice something. We need to keep this argument valid. That is, the truth of the first and second premises has to guarantee the truth of the conclusion. So if we change premise 2 in this way, we also have to change premise 1. Right? We have to add to premise 1 the same sort of clause. Moral claims are subject to very persistent disagreement. That is not best explained by human error. It's only by, well, modifying 1 to fit with 2 that the argument still flows, that the argument is still valid. Well, now we have to re-examine 1. now that we have a new first premise, is it plausible anymore? Moral claims are subject to very persistent disagreement that is not best explained by human error. Well, now we're not so sure, right? And Shafer-Landau says some things to suggest that one is maybe not all that plausible. He goes through 3 different causes of human error or varieties of human error. Let's just touch on them very briefly. They do seem to result in a lot of moral disagreement. So one example that he gives is, the kind of human error that involves ignorance. Now, this would need, if it's going to be relevant to premise 1, it would need to be ignorance that results in certain moral beliefs and thereby results in moral disagreement. One example that I remember a student giving recently when we were talking about this was their relatives. The student had relatives who thought that, and this is just a factual mistake, the relative thought that in the state of Connecticut, they had recently passed a law that allowed abortion up through 9 months of pregnancy and then beyond, up until the newborn was several weeks old. This person didn't live in Connecticut. This person isn't a lawyer. This person isn't a doctor or anything. They had read this on the internet, right? And so they had this fact in mind, right? That Connecticut now permitted abortion through a few weeks of life, post-birth. Okay, this is not true, right? But this person, they lacked a certain kind of street smarts, except for we're talking about the streets of the internet, right? Where this person was confronted with some claim and they didn't know to be immediately skeptical. It's sort of like, this is just a side note, but it's sort of like when you get that phone call, that robocall, and it says, "Hi, I'm calling from Card Member Services, and there's a problem with your credit card account." And you hear that, and it's like a recorded voice, and you immediately hang up. Because no, this is not someone calling from credit card services. There's no problem with my credit card account. If there really was a problem with my credit card account, I would get something in the mail. And also, if I was called by a credit card company, they would say the name of the company, right? They wouldn't just say credit card services. So don't trust this. And the same thing about various memes or whatever that claim that Connecticut passed some law. But this person doesn't have these mechanisms. They don't have these mechanisms for weeding out the bad information. And so they wind up with ignorance. They don't just wind up with a few instances of ignorance. This is why it's such a good example that the student gave. They wind up with pervasive ignorance all over the place because they don't have a system in place to keep the ignorance away. And so they get all of these mistaken beliefs in their head, and they result in mistaken moral beliefs. Claims about whether the behavior of the legislature in the state of Connecticut is right or wrong, is good or evil. That's a moral belief, and that results from this kind of ignorance. And that will, if this person, right, disagrees with you morally, that disagreement is going to stick around. Okay, here's another kind of human error. Failure of imagination. By this, Shafer-Landau means something rather specific. It's not just any old imagination. We're talking about imagining what it's like to be another person. People are very bad at this, and this results in mistaken moral beliefs. Take the story, this is a famous story. It's not true, they say, I think. I think historians have shown that this didn't really happen the way it happened or something like that. But Marie Antoinette, she was the Queen of France or something, and the people were rioting or something, and they were rioting because they were hungry, and she asks, supposedly, her servant or something like that, why are they rioting? And the answer is, because they don't have any bread, and so they're hungry. And she says, so let them eat cake. Now, side note, either she never said that, or if she said that, she might have meant apparently, like, cake might have been a term, whatever the French word was, I don't know. This was all in French, I think. whatever the French word was, it was the cake that's sort of like the debris of the bread that gets left in the oven or something and like bakes at the bottom or something like that. The suggestion was that they should eat that. Look, I don't know. Anyway, the point is, even if she had said the "let them eat cake" comment, then it would be because she just can't imagine what it's like not to be royalty. And that this is going to result not just in beliefs about how other people's lives are, but in moral beliefs, moral claims about her own behavior, that she is not under any duty to change her lifestyle, for example. That's a moral claim, and that results from a failure of imagination. And then the third type of human error that's discussed are just various kinds of biases, right? People just somehow are tempted to think that, well, maybe, for example, they have some kind of racial bias. So they just sort of like subtly feel that the suffering of one racial group just feels worse than a similar amount of suffering to another racial group, or something like that. It doesn't have to be racial. There's a million types of biases. And that these biases lead to moral beliefs, and if they lead to moral beliefs, then they could lead to moral disagreement. And if they lead to moral disagreement, well, then that disagreement, very plausibly, because of these things, right, might persist for a long time. What was the point of all that? Why did we just talk about all those kinds of human error? Well, it's because we were trying to put pressure on premise 1. Is premise 1 really true? Once we revise premise 2 and update premise 1 as a result, is premise 1 even correct? Moral claims are subject to very persistent disagreement that is not best explained by human error. Well, after going through this whole discussion, in the chapter from the Shafer-Landau book that we read, Shafer-Landau just sort of grants that, yeah, I could put pressure on this premise, but actually something like this is probably true. It's probably true that there is some very persistent moral disagreement, the kind of disagreement that we don't find in science, because science has established and accepted empirical methods that involve looking at things and smelling things and hearing things, using one's senses, right? That's what we mean by empirical. Science has these empirical methods. Ethics, moral theory does not. And so there really does seem to be quite a bit of moral disagreement that sticks around and can't be attributed, at least not best attributed, to some kind of error on the part of human beings. So he's willing to grant premise 1. But then he returns again to consider this version, this so far best, most powerful, most persuasive version of premise 2. So let's take one more look at premise 2. If some claims are subject to very persistent disagreement that is not best explained by human error, then they are not objectively true. It seems like there might be some counterexamples to this claim. I mean, we already saw one counterexample to an earlier version of this claim. That was the string theory disagreement among physicists, right? It was an example where, well, the first part of the claim, the antecedent, it's called, is satisfied, but the consequent, the second part, is not. So if some claims are subject to very persistent disagreement that is not best explained by human error, a counterexample would be a case where there's very persistent disagreement, it's not best explained by human error, but we don't then conclude from that that there's no objective truth about the matter that's under disagreement. Okay, so what is this counterexample? Here's what it is. So moral claims, in a way, are philosophical claims. This is a philosophy class, and it's all about morality. But there are also non-moral philosophical claims, things that philosophers have been disagreeing about very persistently. Here's two examples. One kind of claim that philosophers have been disagreeing about for a very long time are claims about the existence or non-existence of God. That's something that there is very, very persistent disagreement about. And you might think that this disagreement It sometimes happens among people who make a great deal of rational errors, but it also happens between or among people who might be making some rational errors, but it doesn't seem like they're making lots of them. And the rational errors don't seem like the best explanation for the disagreement. So there seems to be very persistent disagreement about whether God exists, lasting many, many generations, many hundreds, many thousands of years. It's not best explained by human error. It's not obviously best explained by human error. But we don't then suppose that there's no objective truth. There's no objective fact about whether God exists. Once we define what we're talking about, once we define God as, well, something rather specific, an all-good, all-powerful, all-knowing being, then there's just an objective fact about whether a being like that exists. Just like there's an objective fact about whether a creature like a unicorn exists. It's like a horse, it's got one horn. We specify enough about this entity that we're talking about, and then it's just a question. Does this thing exist? There's an objective fact about that. And there's an objective fact about this, but there's very persistent disagreement about it. Another example of a topic on which there is very, very persistent disagreement, but on which it seems kind of absurd to say that there's no objective truth, is whether or not humans have free will. On the one hand, it seems like from the inside, our choices are our own. Our actions are ours to decide. We do what we choose to do, and we could have chosen otherwise. But on the other hand, it seems like, well, either all of our actions are determined neurologically or historically by all of the motion of all of the particles and everything that's come before, and it's just guaranteed that you are going to decide to, well, eat that candy bar or pick a salad or whatever the choice is. Or maybe there's some kind of fundamental randomness to reality, right? But if that's the case, then the actions that result from that deep, basic, fundamental randomness, well, then you're not really responsible for those either because, well, it was just random. Anyway, there's persistent disagreement about that. But it's not obvious that from that we should conclude that there's no fact of the matter about whether or not humans have free will. We either have it or we don't, you might think. And that's just an objective fact. If these counterexamples work, then this premise just isn't true, even in this most plausible form. And if this premise isn't true, then this argument is no good. Okay, next, and finally, Shafer-Landau does something rather clever. Remember what the point of this argument was. The point of the argument was to show that moral skepticism, skepticism about the existence of objective moral truths, show that that view is correct. What Shafer-Landau does is he runs this argument against moral skepticism itself. That is, he runs a different version of this argument, keeps premise 2 the same, by the way, runs a version of this argument that takes advantage of the following fact. Moral skepticism is also the subject of very persistent disagreement. The thesis that there are no objective moral truths, people disagree about that too. And they keep disagreeing about it and have been disagreeing about it for a very long time. So here's the argument. He runs this same argument. This happens very quickly in like one little short paragraph at the end of the chapter, but it's almost certainly the most interesting thing that happens in the chapter. We get another version of this argument, not written out, in these premises and this conclusion. I mean, this argument never appears quite like this in the chapter that we read. I was sort of pulling this out. But we get a version of this argument that is an attack on moral skepticism. Here's how it goes. Okay, let's read through this argument and note several things about it. 1, moral skepticism is subject to very persistent disagreement. and then I just use some ellipses because it's actually very tiring to write on this board. Very persistent disagreement that is not best explained by human error. Seems plausible. If this is plausible, then this is plausible, right? I mean, if moral claims, well, they're definitely subject to very persistent disagreement. And moral skepticism itself, the claim that there are no objective moral truths, that's definitely subject to very persistent disagreement. And if the disagreement about moral claims can't be best explained by human error, then the disagreement about moral skepticism, it seems, also can't be explained by human error. It would be the same kinds of error, we might think. Okay. 2, if some claim is subject to very persistent disagreement that is not best explained by human error, then it is not objectively true. Okay, I changed one thing about premise 2 when I rewrote it as applied to moral skepticism, and the only thing that's changed is that, well, it's now singular. We're talking about just one claim. If some claim is, rather than if some claims are. Okay, but it seems like that difference shouldn't matter. If the general case applies, if some group of claims, if you could say this about some group of claims, then surely you can say it about an individual claim, we might think, right? And then I use the ellipses, but that's just because my arm is tired. I don't think that makes a difference. And then 3, therefore, moral skepticism is not objectively true. This would be bad for the moral skeptic, right? Because remember, moral skepticism is not itself a moral claim, right? Moral skepticism is not a claim about ethics. It's a claim of meta-ethics. So moral skeptics want their theory to be, well, objectively true, and they're arguing with the moral objectivists, trying to convince them that moral skepticism has been true all along. So this argument is bad news for the moral skeptic. If it turns out that this conclusion is true, then the moral skeptic doesn't get what she wants. And the argument is valid. If the first and second premises are true, then the conclusion is guaranteed to be true. It's a valid argument. And premise 1 is very plausible. So the only avenue that the moral skeptic can go down to save her theory is to attack premise 2. But premise 2 is the same in this argument as it is in this argument, except for the one claim about whether we're talking singularly about a claim or plurally about multiple claims. And so we might think that if the moral skeptic attacks this premise and tries to undermine it as it's used in this argument against her own view, then she can't then turn around and appeal to that very same premise when she's trying to support her view or establish her view in the first place. That's it.